Today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hans van Tilburg from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Specifically, he is the NOAA Maritime Heritage Coordinator for the NOAA Office of National Sanctuaries here in Hawaii. Should be a great acronym, right?
We've got nothing but acronyms.
Hans has spoken to us a couple of times before, telling us the story of the 1 to 2,000 vessels and aircraft that were lost in Hawaii waters during World War II. But today he's going to talk about a much older shipwreck here in the islands, a Civil War gunboat, the USS Saginaw. It's an exciting story. Please welcome Hans from Tilburg.
Thank you for having me back. It's an honor to come and talk with you folks. And it's Friday and there's pizza. So you're doing a fantastic job here. This is a story that I like because, this is a time in the Navy when we assume now that we have the largest Navy in the world, but you have to go back in time to 1860, 1859 when this was launched because we were nothing like that back then. So this is a startling tale of a very small, humble vessel in the largest ocean of the world doing some very important things that ultimately led us further west and into the Pacific as a nation. That's what I like about it. You can see the general arena for this tale of USS Saginaw. It's the tale of Mare Island, Naval Shipyard as well. This was the first naval shipyard built on the West Coast, and the Saginaw was the first naval ship built at the first naval shipyard. Didn't look like much, in the 1850s when they laid down the initial buildings, but of course it's a large complex there now if you've ever been outside of Vallejo in the Bay Area, and now it's been decommissioned and shut down, but played a major role in World War II and other wars as well. This is what it looked like back then, Mare Island. It was really kind of a test of California's ability to build a successful small vessel for the Pacific. You can see in this poster the image of the floating dry dock, some of the buildings, the foundries going up, some of the local marine traffic in the Bay Area. Really a fascinating story unto itself. And cows all over the place.
There's a captain there that's working his way up in the...
Yeah. I recognize that name. Here's someone else that you might recognize as well. Rear Admiral Thomas Tingy Craven. Do you remember John Craven and the story that he kind of blazed through maritime history, naval history? This is a relation of John Craven. Thomas Tingy Craven was the commanding officer at Mare Island for a period when the Saginaw was there, and Commodore of the Pacific Fleet. And when I say Pacific Fleet, I'm talking about maybe 2 or 3 vessels in the Pacific. We had not made the decision to have a large navy. That came later in the 1880s, 1890s. We were sticking with ideas like Thomas Jefferson's, we're a country of gentlemen farmers. We don't need a big navy. We just need a few vessels to keep us in the game. Well, this was one of them, called a sloop of war, but this is an extremely small one. This is a steamer, a side-wheel steamer, 2-masted steamer, and, only 155 feet length overall. So can you imagine that in the Pacific? When I sailed with my dad, he used to tell me, for every 5 miles you go off the coast, the vessel gets 1 foot shorter. We started with a 30-foot sloop, so that's pretty small. And this is 1859, so vessels are already being built with propellers. But this is a throwback to what they call the earnest principles of the side-wheeler. Not such a great idea for ocean vessels when you think about it. The open ocean, the swells, one paddle wheels in, one's out. You can imagine what that's doing to the forces on the shaft and the engine, or trying to calculate the amount of coal you need when, as the engine burns the coal, the vessel's coming up out of the water and less of the paddles are going in. But those were the first earliest steamers, of course, paddle wheels. It's not the greatest thing for open oceans.
So they didn't have a stern screw.
Right, no screw. But that was the way to go. The propeller, the screw was, of course, the way to go. And iron hulls, not wooden hulls. Here's an image in 1858. I just show you this because for some strange reason, there are only 2 or 3 actual pictures of the USS Saginaw. It's very unfortunate. I've looked for years, but this is one of them. And the museum in Vallejo, the Naval and Maritime Museum, didn't know. But in 1858, there's only one vessel being built on the ways at Mare Island, and that's the Saginaw, up on the ways, and the launching ways there. Just a couple images of the layout, the compartments. You can see the large forecastle forward for the crew in bunks lining the sides of the hull, and the large engine spaces, this whole center of the vessel being dominated by the steam engine. And of course, that took away a lot of cargo space, a lot of space for the ordnance, for the guns, and then the officers and stewards aft in those areas. And on the main weather deck, you can see both fore and aft the tracks for pivot guns, rifle pivot guns. We're talking about 1858, 1859, 1860. There's a lot of innovation going on with rifle cannon becoming much, much more powerful. So she carried 2 30-pounder rifle guns. She has some broadside guns as well, but not really heavily armed. This is kind of minimal, really. In this one, you can see the central engineering spaces with the boiler face, with 3 fire grates, and then what was a little unique at the time, these were the steam cylinders, and they're pivoting. They're pivoted steam cylinders, and they're connected directly to the crankshaft. So as the shaft goes around, these cylinders are just pivoting back and forth. These are the service areas for the Saginaw. For such a small vessel, made with not much of investment on the West Coast, she certainly played an international and regional game. Beginning after being launched over on the China Station in Hong Kong and Japan and Korea and other places. After that, during the Civil War, serving along Panama, La Paz, and Acapulco. And then after the Civil War, going up to Alaska, which we had recently purchased in about 1867 for, was it $4 million? They called it Seward's Icebox, Seward's Folly. They made fun of him for purchasing Alaska from the Russians. And then finally ending her life out in the middle of the Pacific at Ocean Island or Kure Island. In East Asia, we were kind of a minimal presence. If you know about maritime history in the Pacific or East Asia, this was a period when the British were importing illegal opium to the Chinese Empire and forcing open treaty ports at the end of a gun, sometimes at war with the Chinese imperial forces. We were doing a little bit of the same thing, but we were kind of rode the coattails of the French and the British. We didn't have many ships, certainly like this, seen in Hong Kong. The hulks you see in the middle of the picture, which are de-rigged, without masts, are storage ships for the opium that's being imported from India to China to make major profits for these British companies. It's not a great hour of British history, what was going on. It forced a couple opium wars. But we were there, and the Saginaw was there, caught in that fracas, trying to protect American citizens abroad. During the Civil War, as you know, it's mostly fought on the East Coast in the Gulf of Mexico. What was happening in the Pacific? Well, there were a lot of fast steamships leaving San Francisco with gold from the gold fields, headed down to Panama to tranship that gold to the Union. And those vessels needed escorting because there were actually plans from rogue Confederate sailors who stripped their uniforms off and went out to Mexico to capture a vessel and attack those ships. And so a lot of the efforts for the small little Saginaw during the Civil War, 1861, 1865, were patrolling these Mexican ports, which at that time were at war. The Mexicans were at war with the French. And Maximilian and the Imperial French forces were fighting there. So we were just trying to protect Americans in those ports. And in Alaska, having just been purchased, the Saginaw was in support of Army garrisons newly established by the U.S. Army, charting the narrow passages. She was small enough of a shallow draft enough to go in and out of certain dangerous passages, and spent a lot of time up there kind of enforcing military discipline on some of the local tribes. And it's not a great history there for us either. There were some shelling of some villages that happened. Much more of what was going on was just trying to keep the sailors out of the brig for drinking too much. This is a period in American history where alcohol, which everyone was imbibing in huge quantities, was also seen as the root of all evil. And so it was a very big deal for the sailors not to be caught doing that.
Away with rum, by gum.
That's right. The story of her final service and loss has to do with Midway Atoll, which had been claimed by the U.S. Navy in 1857. The idea was that, Hawaii is an independent kingdom, and the merchants would have loved to see a Navy support for a coal depot in Honolulu. That involved a lot of diplomacy and complications. Why don't we put a coal depot up there on tiny Midway Atoll, which we've claimed? So that was the federal claim for Midway, which is still an unincorporated U.S. territory, right? U.S. property. There was nothing there on Midway. There were no trees. It was a barren atoll island. And the last of Saginaw's 9 commanders, and she actually had service on board of 9 different commanders, who ended up being 9 rear admirals, because the U.S. Navy was not big. It probably wasn't thrilling for a lieutenant commander to be posted to a 155-foot vessel, but nonetheless, Montgomery Sicard makes the best of it. And Sicard was from New York. He was her final commander. He ended up being in control of the Bureau of Ordnance after this service. But his assignment was to support a couple hard hat divers from Boston to go up to find a channel into the lagoon at Midway and blast a clear channel open. And Saginaw was given $50,000, 6 months to do the job. These hard hat divers from Boston were used to dealing with rocks, so they could break a rock apart or put a charge and split a rock. But when you place a charge on coral, you end up with a huge amount of little bits of coral. And they're scratching well, they can't scratch their heads underwater. Saying, what do we do now? Back and forth up to Midway and Honolulu, trying to support this effort. Ultimately, it fails. They could not open a channel into the lagoon at that time. This shows you one of the devices that was patented to break apart rocks in Boston anyway. Kind of a remotely operated pole chisel affair that you could operate from the surface. But they were using charges as well. And this is a rare picture. This is a postcard from Honolulu, 1869. The vessel's, close to being at the end of her service, being lost. But there's Montgomery Sicard on the left and his crew. And these guys are in their 20s. But even from this picture, I think you can see they look a lot older. And I imagine some of that was experiencing and surviving the Civil War. Because it was difficult service. They had all been on the blockade duties in the Gulf of Mexico and the East Coast. It was not a service that was glorified. It was not a volunteer Navy, certainly. Probably English was not the most common language in the U.S. Navy at the time. And when your Navy is not even second or third in the world, not even fourth or fifth, but certainly before the Civil War and after the Civil War, our Navy is very small. During the Civil War, we push into service everything that'll float. We have a 600-ship Navy. We're talking about anything that'll float. But we were probably 1869 number 12 in the world, because the decision had been made that all we need are enough vessels to have a coastal defense force. We, as a young nation, don't need to be projecting our power overseas. That's for those old powers in Europe. We don't want to go down that road. That all changes decades later, of course. But here are these guys who survived the Civil War on the Saginaw. So what happens? It's time to pack up the hard hat divers who have failed at their job and get them back to San Francisco. Sicard, the commanding officer, does something very responsible. He's heard during his last trip to Honolulu that there were some shipwrecks at Ocean Island, about 70 miles away. Kure Atoll. So he's going to swing by Ocean Island and make sure no one's waiting for rescue there before returning to Honolulu and San Francisco. They misjudge the current that sets to the west, and at about 3 a.m., it's the world's slowest shipwreck. There's barely way. They've tamped down the fire grates, not enough steam to really do anything. They're just kind of wallowing along in the darkness. Cloudy, no moon, pitch black, and finally breakers ahead, and they can't maneuver out of the way. And so he makes the decision to run her head on, maybe save the ship and pull her off later. There's the reef spot. Coral reef does not get along well with wooden hulls. And so pretty soon the coral was smashing into the engine room, and it was time to abandon ship. There's the camp on Kure Atoll on Green Island, and there's what it looks like today. And everyone got off the vessel. You know, it's difficult on the corals. People are cutting their feet open, but they salvaged over the next period of weeks and months everything they could from the vessel. Sometimes Sicar's just sending them out there to work on the pieces of the wreck just to give them something to do. He's got to control, 93 crewmen who speak multiple languages, living on this, exposed green island under difficult conditions, eating nothing but monk seal and woody birds, albatross. Very salty, very oily. They were not happy. But he maintained control of them. There were some pits they made to chase the albatross into the pits, and the rats were swarming in the holes. Then the monk seals, he had to kind of regulate that. No more than a couple monk seals a week. It was kind of brutal. They go out there and they just take a bath and smash the monk seal on the head. What could they do? They set up the donkey boiler as a makeshift still, and they were able to make water. And they lit the still with their last match. So, months and months at Green Island, waiting for a ship to come by. And also building a vessel on the beach, which, as we talked about earlier, is a pretty common thing to do when you're shipwrecked. Use the parts of your wreck to build a vessel, a rescue vessel called Deliverance. A lot of the rescue vessels built in the northwestern Vermont Islands are called Deliverance. And also outfit the captain's gig, which was an existing boat that he could, put 5 people on board and send back to Honolulu on a rescue mission. So they were building one that was larger, but at the same time they outfitted the gig with a new suit of sails, modifications to the deck. 5 volunteers are going to go on board, and the young lieutenant was John Gunnel Talbot, who would be nominally in charge. The only survivor will be coxswain William Halford. A lot of the provisions they put into this small boat to make the 1,500-mile sail back to Honolulu were spoiled by water. They had 5 gallons of whale oil as well for the lamps. The lamps wouldn't light. Halford was the only one that could drink and keep down the whale oil. So maybe he had a little more energy left when they hit the beach on the north shore of Kauai. But they were emaciated, almost weak, almost incapable of functioning. It was pretty difficult. They were able to grab some seabirds out of the air, eat them raw. But they did navigate to the rocks near Kauai Island, came ashore near Honolulu Bay, also in the middle of the night. By the time they get there, they can't even maneuver the vessel to keep her out of the surf. So the gig rolls in the surf, 4 die, and Halford is the only one living. He makes it to some local inhabitants there who take him to the sheriff. Ultimately, he gets word back to Honolulu, and a rescue mission is off from the steamer Kilauea up to Kure to get the rest of the crew, bring them back to Hawaii. There's the gig. As typical for shipwrecks like this, the crew then need to make their way back home somehow, because there is no naval station or anything that's going to pay for that. So they begin selling off everything they have and taking charity from local residents. They sold the gig, but it was returned and it actually still exists. And it's in Saginaw, Michigan, on display there. And you can see they've decked it over and made 4 open compartments to try to keep the seas out. Wonderful story. We knew about this story. Sicard even put an X on the map, little dot, Saginaw, 1870. What archaeologist wouldn't like that? He also wrote in the Glyphs things there, a whaler. 1809. We did find that one as well. But we thought, man, this is the perfect setup. You know, we could go up there, we could probably just jump in the water and dive, and we're going to find the wreck of the Saginaw. I mean, there it is on the map. Well, it's a little more difficult than that. In NOAA, we have a Maritime Heritage Program, and so our job is to, locate, inventory, assess significant properties, and then share that history with the American public. I mean, if there was like a channel or something of development going in here, you'd want to know if there was a historic wreck site or something like that. There isn't anything like that, so we're just looking for the historical significance in this case. You can see the paths where we're towing the magnetometer up and down the outside of the coral reef in the light blue. And we're getting as close to the reef crest as we can with the magnetometer, which senses iron. Cannons, anchors, couldn't get a signal from it at all. Unfortunate. The reef itself is surrounded by a radiating series of spurs and grooves called spur and groove topography. If you've dived at coral atolls, you know the topography is quite dramatic. These grooves actually serve to funnel ocean water into the lagoon and out of the lagoon. So it kind of protects the lagoon. But it makes it difficult for us because we also want to put in the water things like side-scan sonar, which we want to pull underwater as close to the bottom as possible to find anything that sticks up that looks like a wreck site, but we can't do that with the topography that's there. So this is multi-beam imagery, sonar imagery of the spur and grooves. And you can see, as close as we can get, the wreck site is right in here, right next to the reef crest, some of it. And we couldn't get a signal at all from high-resolution multi-beam sonar in 20 feet of water. So the fancy tools we have to find big wrecks will not find scattered sites like this historic event at all. We had to dive for it, which means we had to take the dive boats in near the reef crest on calmer days, jump in the water, and then kind of go in and out of the surge channels looking for traces of the wreck. Well, the dive boat would stand off further out to sea and then come on in and pick us up. And some days we just couldn't dive there at all. But you can see how dramatic the topography is underwater. But ultimately, yes, I'm glad to say we did find the site. Sometimes you hear, the storm was rising, air was getting low, that kind of thing. It's the last dive of the project. But I'm here to tell you, I was there. The storm was rising, the air was getting low. It was the last dive of 2003. And we came across a little puka with brass sheathing tacks. Just little nails. And you'd think if you saw that anywhere else, you'd think, it's just some nails, But nails aren't going to transport themselves 1,200 miles across the ocean. If you find anything out there, something bad happened. No one got close to the reef on the east side to dispose of some nails. Right? And then we found some of the broadside 24-pounder howitzers. You see the cannon in the lower right with the trunnions on each side for pivoting the howitzer up and down. There were 4 of those broadside cannon. Then we found a couple of the anchors that would have been stored in the bow, like the sheet anchor, the main anchor. And then we found large reefs that were solid metal. That's actually the chain locker, and all the chain is fused together and encrusted. So we're looking at bow equipment, looking at where the bow struck the reef. We had to scour the area pretty well because the site it's a high energy environment. And so over a period of a week on site and then returning seasonally over the next couple of years, we finally did the best job we could to map the site. Here we found the trunnioned oscillating steam cylinders with the piston connecting rod, there on the right. And then, the bronze and brass machinery parts from the midship section of the wreck, which is a ways away from the bow section. This was really exciting for us to see these things. They're not in very good shape, though. And finally, the big, paddle wheel shaft itself, solid iron. The paddle wheels, the wood paddle wheels, are long gone, long broken up. But the paddle wheel shaft and more items like the boat's anchor, etc., are scattered in another cove to the south. These still pictures just don't really do it justice. I mean, if you weren't careful in these surge channels, you'd find yourself sucked through a funnel and into the lagoon, and the boat had to go all the way around to pick you up. So there's some difficult diving conditions.
Did that happen?
It's happened in a couple places. Here's the boiler up on the reef, so the outer ocean is further out past the reef crest, but blown into closer to the lagoon, the boiler face, and our sketch of the remnants of it, and matching it to plans we pulled from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And then there's a wide area of scattered artifacts in the lower energy environment of the back reef and lagoon itself. And this is very typical for a lot of the shipwrecks we've seen in atolls. What happens is the vessel goes in, bow first, gets locked into the reef, the stern bounces up and down until the rudder breaks off. The rudder then floats around and is usually found up by the bow. The pintles from the rudder, the heavy bronze pintles are found up there. And then the ship breaks in two and the stern section kind of drifts some distance away. It's exactly what we saw here. And it's a pattern of site formation that we see actually over and over again with whalers and other vessels that are lost up there. But this was an interesting find because we did want to see these Parrott 30-pounder rifled cannon. Powerful Civil War era, muzzle-loaded, reinforced breech end cannons firing not cannonballs, but 30-pounder explosive shells. This is kind of, in a nutshell, a story of the Civil War, why it was so terrible, because advances like this had been made in ordnance, massively more powerful guns, but the tactics of the North and the South hadn't changed very much. So you still had formations of Civil War troops marching into the power of guns like this. Rodman and Parrott were engineers who developed this kind of weaponry, and it was really surprisingly much more powerful than anything that people had had before, these rifle cannon. They're the two from the pivoting areas of the Saginaw's wreck. So this shows you how we began to understand the wreck site and the wrecking process itself, the initial impact, how the vessel turns, kind of broadside to the incoming swells, breaks apart. And even in Sicard's own sketches, you can see the stern half of the wreck blown further down and up onto the reef after initially being intact. And then the debris area we found in the lagoon. And we agreed with him that there was probably not more than 3 days during the year when the sea is quiet, but when, in my opinion, it would be possible to work over any part without great danger. That just didn't stop him from sending his men out there, though.
So the debris trail is inside the lagoon?
Yeah, I mean, imagine all the fasteners and the bits in the rigging as the masts are blown over. All that lighter stuff is going to carry on into the lagoon. The heavier things, the cannon, the anchors, are going to be at the forward end of the reef crest.
But who did these sketches?
Me. Oh, the one on the left?
No, the pictures.
The beautiful one on the left I did. The amateur stuff on the right I'm just kidding. The commanding officer, Montgomery Sicard.
Okay.
He had plenty of time to sketch and make notes. And that's why doing history and archaeology on naval wrecks is so rewarding, because the Navy travels on a sea of paperwork. So, we found all that stuff. All of his notes, all of the medical officer's assessments of the men as they lost weight, all the weird things he was doing to try to take care of diseases and syphilis on board the vessel in Alaska, China. It's an incredible amount of recorded material. And here, finally, you see the one surprising discovery, because we hardly ever find these. It's the ship's bell, or a ship's bell. Ships could have more than one bell. We did recover that a couple years later, and there is no embossed name or anything like that. So it's actually a fairly plain bell. Maybe it's the working bell, the day-to-day bell they use to regulate activities on board. There may have been a ceremonial bell they kept for other reasons and brought out, but this one was actually very plain. It's not something we often find on wreck sites. What we do find on wreck sites a lot, and we did find it on the Saginaw site, it's a little ironic, is we find the lead weights, the sounding leads. Finding a sounding lead on a shipwreck site is ironic. Here's a little better picture of the locations where we mapped in the artifact distribution. A lot of these areas, when we're in the reef crest, there's no way we can stick our hand up or get a GPS for a shot of the coordinates in there. So we're using compass and tape methods to measure how far things are up the channels. In the back reef, though, we can put a GPS unit on it and get a shot, a location fairly accurate for this large dispersal pattern, also very common in the atolls. There are elements of the story that were known, of course, and remain. You know, the world did watch or wait for months in the day and age of newspapers being carried by sailing ships to hear about the fate of these, you know, these poor sailors in the Pacific, and it was a pretty big deal. And so when they did arrive back at Honolulu, they were greeted by the king, and there was a dinner held, and, you know, there were a lot of good, nice things and speeches made, and folks were very happy with the comportment of the U.S. Navy in the Kingdom of Hawaii at that time. And then you can see that there was one particular memorial to John C. Talbot, the young lieutenant who was in charge of the open boat voyage, relatively open boat voyage, and the rest of his crew. And this is at Annapolis, the Naval Academy in Annapolis. The logbook from the Saginaw, sextant which had been modified on the beach for the open boat voyage, boat hook, etc. It's a known story there. There are things out here, though, as well. This is the gig in Saginaw, Michigan, still in one piece, with an S for the Saginaw's gig, which is the captain's gig on board, and has been maintained. You can see all the patchwork they did on the beach with the copper sheathing. They took off the wreck of the hull to reinforce the hull of the open small boat for the 1,500-mile voyage. On the coamings of the hatches themselves, you can see those guys had plenty of days to scratch in their names, just in case the boat came ashore and they didn't, at least someone would know. And so they wrote in their names Talbot, and Andrews, and Muir, etc.
What was the Navy doing about not knowing where their ship was?
Well, you know, the commandant at Mare Island was sending out other vessels, or at least trying to get word out to other harbors to be on the lookout. But when the Pacific Fleet is, you know, 3 ships, you don't really have the ability to be sending them out there to look. So I don't think that they were actively patrolling to look. There was certainly no asset they had in Honolulu that was going to go up to the atolls. But all they knew was that, you know, he had by then he should have had left Midway, and he should have shown up in Honolulu. So they wouldn't imagine that he had wrecked a Kure next to Midway. They didn't send any vessel up there. There's a Maritime Museum in Vallejo in the Bay Area near Mare Island and Shipyard, and they've got a model, a 2-masted model. This is a recent one. For a while there was some confusion, so they had a model of a 3-masted Saginaw, which is a little embarrassing to inform them of that. But this is kind of a nice one. I don't know about the bulwarks being that tall over the main deck, but you get the idea. This is not a big ship.
And the mast is to use sails also, right?
Right, absolutely. Steam would have been an auxiliary source, propulsion for going in and out of harbors. But, you know, especially after the Civil War, when the economizing expenditures in the Navy was such a big deal, you had to justify the use of coal on board a Navy ship. And if you're using too much coal and for not the proper reasons, you know, you damage your own career. So they're sailing a lot of the time, and they're not underpowered. We were not a major Navy. But here, you can visit the beach where they rolled ashore on Kauai, at Kalihiwai. And if you go to Naval Cemetery, in the naval section, there's a headstone for Peter Francis, John Andrews, and James Muir. Talbot was initially buried on Kauai, but exhumed and taken back, I think, to Ohio to his family's plot. And then the 5th sailor, of course, the coxswain, survived. So that headstone is still there.
So some of the people that drowned, they recovered their bodies.
Yeah, you found them, you know, rolled up on the beach later.
All of them.
Yeah. There's been a little bit written. I find the book on the left to be particularly informative. That's the only book that deals with the whole service of the Saginaw at a time when there was a lot going on in the Pacific. The Taiping Rebellion, the Opium Wars in China, purchase of Alaska, the French invasion of Mexico during our Civil War. And so that really is Pacific and regional history seen through the lens of sailors on board the deck of this little Ernest Seigmuller. But the real, the first-hand source is George Reed. He was the paymaster on board the Saginaw. And so he wrote this book called The Last Cruise of the Saginaw, which has come out a couple times, a couple different versions. That's just about the Midway and Kure operation and the loss of the vessel. There's actually a book put together by a man up in Alaska called the U.S. Saginaw in Alaskan Waters, a particular kind of service record. But that's about it. The tale of the Saginaw, or the wreck itself. I don't know if Russell Crowe would be the right person to play Montgomery Sicard. I think we'll need someone else, but it's a great story, so I wonder if sometimes it'll be picked up by someone else. And finally, just recently, a friend of mine in California was nice enough to send me this commemorative coin from the Naval Museum, the Naval and Maritime Museum in Vallejo, which is the USS Saginaw, 1859. First ship built on Mare Island, wrecked on a reef in 1870 at Ocean Beach. So not only do they kind of get the Ocean Beach part wrong, but the third mast has shown up again. So that's, I don't know how that happened, but I'm not going to say anything. If they're a small museum, I'm sure they're doing the best they can.
That way it looks like it ran aground in San Diego.
Yeah. But anyway, it was nice of them to send it along. So that is the tale, and I'd certainly be happy to take any questions. Yes?
Do you know why they named it the Saginaw?
They were going to name it the Tusi for the Chief of Naval Operations before that. So they changed it to Saginaw. I don't remember why. That's a good question, though. It's been a while since I wrote that book. But I don't remember even coming across the reason why they changed it. Yes?
You showed the actual drawings that were used to get the people to build it.
Yeah.
What was the method of making multiple copies so that they could hand it around different parts of the shipyard to get this done? Or was each one hand drawn?
Drafting it? Well, the National Archives will have a set of the original drawings, and that's all I've seen. These kind of, they're called oilskin plans or something like that. They're kind of vellum, dark brown vellum. I don't know at that time how you would make a copy of that, if there was a carbon copying imprint manner. We're talking about 1858.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Maybe they
wondering.
did. But I've only seen that one set at the National Archives.
So they'd walk around with that and make everybody
No,
get
just make a hand copy.
a sketch. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yes?
Do you know if any other ships like this were built at the same time?
This was the first one. Later on, they started building other sloops of war that were larger, 180, 190 feet, and did have three masts. So that's what you really needed for the Pacific station. So, and those were a variety of sailing vessels and steamers. And finally, they adopted the steam screw and screw propulsion for those. But those would come later from Mare Island and other places. They certainly weren't building them at the time that they launched the Saginaw. For a while, the Saginaw was the only one built there at Mare Island, and other vessels that served in the Pacific came over from the Gulf and the Atlantic, particularly after the Civil War, when there was, a surplus, an abundance of ships and not enough tasks for them.
Did you find the other shipwreck?
The Glyphs, yes, yeah.
Oh,
That's one of the many whalers. There were 10 whalers lost in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and we've found 5 of them. For whalers, that's 1809, or, that's very early. So they wouldn't even had, like those islands on a chart or something. And there's no navigational beacon. And if it's a dark night, it's incredibly hazardous to be sailing through there. So I think all of those atolls and low reefs up there, the sharp coral, have been kind of straining out maritime traffic from the Pacific like a rough comb for a good amount of time, and they would just wreck. And what those sites look like now are, the anchors will be recognizable, the tripods for boiling out the whale oil, the bricks, and a lot of times we find ballast. We would call it, pig iron or pig ballast, these rectangular blocks. I think they're like, 120-pound rectangles of crude, of iron. and they use those to line the holes to use as ballast. And those will drop out of the hull pretty quick. All the wooden bits, that's long gone in a warm marine environment. The Trita worm and other critters have taken care of the wood and the perishables long ago. Yeah.
You mentioned the magnetometer wasn't effective.
Right.
But there was some pretty big hunks of metal.
Exactly.
Pictures, right?
Exactly.
Do you know why?
This is the burden in Hawaii. Hawaii, even for those atolls where it used to be a volcanic island which is subsumed, and now there's the coral island itself. There's still a larger background gradient from the basalt in the lava. But especially using a magnetometer around here, like in the main islands, there are just so many lava flows, underwater lava flows, that the background variation in magnetic strength in gamma is so large that it's very difficult to pick out a signal of something like an anchor or even a cannon. So it's a bit of an art than a science, a bit more of an art to using a magnetometer out here. And it doesn't work very well. I had one archaeology friend said, "You're more likely to find a shipwreck by dragging the magnetometer into it and snagging the thing than you are finding a gamma signature on a cannon or something." It's unfortunate.
Robinson's shipwreck was at Pearl and Hermes Island.
Yes.
How far away was that from the Saginaw?
That's several atolls down. So let's see, the whole northwestern isles are about 1,200 miles, maybe 300-400 miles east-southeast of Kure and Midway. And that's also a very high energy environment. They had one vessel in the dead of night, go into the reef, and they were cautiously sailing along, not knowing those waters, right? Sounding with the sounding lead. And I think it was the Hermes that went aground first, and the Pearl came in to try to assist, and then also went aground adjacent. So it's another great story of 80 or 90 people standing around with no shade, eating monk seals and greedy birds.
That must be funny if you're sounding and it's like 7,000 feet, and then all of a sudden it's 70 feet.
That would not be a good feeling. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to tell that story to you guys today.
Thank you.
Dr. Tilburg,
Yes,
may I award you a certificate of appreciation.
certainly.
Thank you for bringing light where there was only darkness.
Wow. Pressure's on now. My pleasure.